Okay, so what are the objectives? A disaster happens, and what are the goals at that point? I mean,
Okay,
how do the
so
goals change?
I mean, the goals are to first make sure your staff is okay, right? That's the first thing. Where's everybody? How's everybody? Um, and it depends, right? If they were That's if we're talking about an immediate kind of, storm, something along those lines. After that, it's to really take an assessment of what might be needed, what our resources are, what's still working. After Sandy, we lost all our trucks. So what's still, our cooler was flooded. Like, so many things happened with Sandy. So what is our infrastructure needs, and so on and so forth, and then how do we go about getting them back up and stuff. Then it's really just how do we get as much food as possible to the areas that need it, and what does that look like? That's kind of the in what we do right when it starts. Right, we also have to assess whether or not that disaster requires a recirculation of our staff. Is it something we can respond to in addition to just doing our day to day, or is it something where we almost need to have two different fronts happening? So there came to be a time with Sandy where there were staff who were just focused on Sandy, and then there was staff who were doing kind of the everyday work, because Sandy did not affect every community in New York City. With the pandemic, everybody's responding to the pandemic because it's so widespread. So that's kind of what we do pre or midst of disaster. So I'm assuming you mean what do we do after, but the question. Post loss part.
That was good. Thank
Let's see what is next. So what do you do to help better prepare places for future disaster? Um, so in New York, there is something called the Policy Committee on Hunger Resources. And New York is very unique in that it's one of the few places where there are multiple food banks or food funders, right? If you go if you go to DC, there's one food bank. If you go to Philly, there's one food bank. New York City has two food banks, us and the food bank for New York City. And then there's two different governmental entities that distribute food, one from the state, one from the city. So the Human Resources Administration, they have something called the Emergency Food Assistance Program that provides food. Then you have another nonprofit called United Way that also distributes food. So there's all these folks out there doing the same thing. So we have a committee that was formed maybe 20 years ago, and through that we've been doing disaster training with the agency network. So everything from how to access resources in the midst of disaster, how to safeguard your if you're in a flood zone, how do you safeguard that? How can you operate after a disaster? You know, different um, different things like that. So I mean, nothing we did prepared us for the pandemic, but um, as a group of funders, as the policy committee, we do try to hold trainings every year at one of our conferences, because like Food Bank for New York City does an annual agency conference, and they always have a, a session on disaster planning. Um, we've been thinking about writing it. We all have, as a policy committee, we've agreed that everyone's going to have an agreement that they sign to distribute emergency food. We've been thinking about writing that they have to have a disaster plan into that, but we realized that we first need to train them on what a disaster plan is, which is why we're doing those sessions before we hold them to that standard. Because again, these are little old ladies and grandmothers and grandfathers who are running these programs, and they won't know where to get those resources elsewhere. How do you feel that the work environment and culture at City Harvest has impacted your work? Do you enjoy the work environment there? And then there's also a second question that's similar. What is the work environment and culture like while working with City Harvest? So it's interesting because there are multiple cultures at City Harvest, right? So different departments and areas have different cultures. I can only honestly speak for my department. Um, I will say there are some cultures at City Harvest I don't like. Like there are definitely people who they kind of ride their teams a little harder than I think is necessary, and there's no work-life balance, and you know you're expected to work much later than you should and not take vacation and all that, and we're working on that. We have a wonderful new HR person who's working on that. Thank goodness. But I think, you know, on my side of the world, what I really like about it is that I think it's more congenial. I think, you know, folks, um, I very much believe in work-life balance. So my staff will tell you I check their vacation days and try to make them take it. Um, I believe if you're sick, stay home, and I believe that before the pandemic. Um, and I don't know, and like even before I ran the department, I always really liked working with my team. It was always fun but serious. Like everyone wanted to get the work done and believed in what they did and cared for one another. Um, there's a member of he wasn't my staff at the time because I was in a different position, so we were colleagues. I was getting divorced, and he showed up at my house with a television because I was moving into a new apartment, and he said, "You don't need to spend all that money on new things. My sister has a TV in the basement," and he just randomly bought a TV to my house. So that's, and he also randomly brings me curry goat, and that's the one thing I miss about going into the office. So you know, that's kind of how the departments are in the food food distribution, programmatic, political side. But yeah, there's a ton of different. You can walk through the offices and see multiple cultures happening um, in the organization. Um, as I will say this though, the one common denominator for everyone there is that they really believe in what they're doing. They may go about doing it in different ways, but they all really believe in the work. And so that's the one kind of, you know, grounding factor that exists across the board. As Vice President in Program Operations at City Harvest, how were you able to move up the ladder to the position, and what are some of your daily responsibilities? Hmm. So I'm going to give you the honest answer. I'm not going to give you the political answer. The honest answer is I was raised, you know, I'm a Black woman, so that has its challenges. And so I was raised that yes, you work hard and you learn a lot, but also it's not just about what you know, it's who you know. So much of advancement is people are biased, right? They pivot to the people they like, they pivot to the people who are similar to them, you know, and very often if my boss is a white woman, she's not looking at me like we might have things in common. I've dealt with that my whole life. You know, I've walked into rooms where people have been talking about music and they were talking about, you know, classic rock, but I walk in the room and they ask me about Jay-Z. Happens all the time, right? I am viewed as different. And so I actually like classic rock. And so I could talk about Creedence Clearwater Revival, but no one thinks that. Um, so for me, it's been uh, I have spent just as much time being good at my job. I've spent the equal amount of time getting to know people and trying to break down some of those biases and such. And it's not fair that I have to do that, but it is something I have to do. And I think that, you know, I have a lot of other people who've worked at City Harvest and have wondered, you know, how do you keep moving up? Like we've had this problem, and people who were in terms of intelligence, and I'm completely willing to admit this, were a million times smarter than me. I'm talking about people who went to like Ivy League schools. I did not, but they did not advance because they thought, you know, just coming to work and doing your job was enough, which it should be, but it wasn't. And so I think that's how I've moved up the ladder. I talk to people. I go out to drinks. I do all the schmoozing. There's a reason they say business deals are made on the golf course. You know, um, what are some of your daily responsibilities? That changes depending on the day. Um, I mean, I think my biggest daily responsibility is that I have about 30 people who are you know, I'm responsible for, and so it may not be a daily responsibility, but I feel like my most important responsibility is to take care of the staff to the best of my ability. If I take care of them, they'll take care of the work, and we'll go from there. So I'm on the executive team, and so I'm often the person on that team who brings up staff and things like that. When the pandemic hit, I spent 3 hours on the phone with the COO explaining that people were going to need mental health services because we were not just responding to a disaster, we were going through it. And so everyone now has free access to BetterHelp, right? You have to take care of your people. So I think it's not a daily responsibility, but it's the one I think is the most important. How much has working for this organization changed your perspective on life? These are very big existential questions. I don't know if it changed my perspective on life. Um, I think I've just learned a lot about people and um, and systems and the ways in which those things have an impact on people's lives. I don't think, even though I worked for the state senate and such, I don't think I had the same view of the ways in which people are impacted by decisions that are outside of their control, right? Especially when you think about food insecurity. People talk a lot about, so like, I'll give this example. Women are more food insecure than men in general. And if you look at the rate of the pay gap, like the rate of pay between women of different ethnicities and white men, the food insecurity chart almost follows it exactly. So white women are better paid than all other women. They're also they're food insecure, but they're the least food insecure. Indigenous women are the most food insecure. They're also the least paid. And so people are food insecure for something that they have no control over. They don't have any control over how much they get paid or how people see them and all of those things. And so really seeing how certain things interconnect, I think that has been a really eye-opening experience for me. And so it makes it so now I'm like, in leading our policy and government relations work, I'm less focused on food security and I'm more focused on racial and economic justice and gender equality, because those things directly feed into food insecurity. What has been successful and unsuccessful in City Harvest, and give examples. What has been successful? Food rescue, right? I mean, this organization started with somebody seeing potato peels or something like that being thrown out and thinking someone can use that, and going into restaurants and then collecting food that they didn't use, or that they were going to throw out and giving it to soup kitchens. And they started on foot, and then they had a van, and then they had trucks, and now we're about to open I don't even know how many square foot facility in Sunset Park, that will be in for the next 30 years. And all that is food rescue, right? I don't even think people knew what food rescue was 40 years ago. So I think that is an example of success. It's also, you now have food rescue is now a big thing, right? Food rescue, they're talking about it. Their government's building it into policies. Like, you can't throw out food, you can't do this. So I think that's been the most successful thing City Harvest has ever done. Unsuccessful. So if you're talking about just like something we tried that I don't think works, is like there was a time when we put food on a truck, the driver would go out and he would basically play Monty Hall on the back of the truck giving out the food. What do you want? Okay, I got this for you. That kind of thing. To the different food programs. But what I saw when I was my truck ride, my truck rides, was drivers are people. They like some agencies better than others. And so they were not necessarily giving out the food in a way that was systematic. It was like, I don't really like him. He wouldn't let me use his bathroom. And so that person got a case of food. Whereas, the lady who gave him a plate got a lot of food, but the person who he gave a case to maybe served more people. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We are all people. I have agency partners that I like more than others, and you have to almost train yourself not to be like not to let that affect your work. So we created an allocation system that was designed to take all these different factors into account, and allocate the food more equitably. We're still, if you ask me, we've been using it for 10 years. It's a horrible, it's not a good system. It didn't account for so many things. It didn't account for variety. So you could give someone potatoes 4 weeks in a row and then wonder why they're rejecting it. It didn't account for the fact that there are 4 other food funders in the city. So sometimes we get someplace and they're like, okay, I don't want your potatoes because I got potatoes from the food bank. It doesn't account for cultural differences. The only real thing that was built into the system was kosher, but that, I mean, yes, there's a large kosher population in New York City, but that is not the only kind of cultural or religious thing that we should be taking into account. We have nothing for halal, like just all of those things. I'm hoping that with the next strategic plan, we completely blow up this allocation system. It takes more work than it's worth. So that it also, I think we took too much autonomy away from the drivers. What if we just said, okay, you have to give a certain poundage number to each agency, but then they could decide, because then it would solve for things like, oh, they just got potatoes. Okay, well, I have these carrots on the truck, so I can give them that because that's also 1,000 pounds. Like we overcorrected. What is your schedule like working in City Harvest? It's typically 9 to 5, unless something Monday through Friday, unless something crazy is going on. Or I have a big deadline or things like that. Or sometimes I go out and visit our mobile markets, which we have some that operate on Saturdays or that start before 9, or like tonight when I have to go to an event and I'll probably be out till 10, 11 o'clock at night. But those are rarities. Because like I said, I believe in work-life balance. How do you decide the location where the food will be delivered? So when I started at City Harvest, people would just call and say, I run a food pantry. Can I have food? That was pretty much it. Then we started using something that Feeding America has, which is Map the Meal Gap. And it basically looks at the neighborhoods that are highest in poverty. And they did that for quite some time. But what we learned is that the meal gap takes into account poverty. It doesn't take into account the fact that we then respond and take food to those places. So what you saw was places like Jamaica, Queens, South Bronx were always like 1 and 2 on that list. Bed-Stuy, well, old Bed-Stuy, not necessarily new Bed-Stuy, but there were certain neighborhoods that just always were at the top of that list. And so like City Harvest and Feeding America were running to not Feeding America, Food Bank for New York City were running to those neighborhoods. And then what we learned was they were getting a ton of food, but then you had these other neighborhoods that also were in need that no one was going to because they weren't like in that top 5. So now what we do is we look at where are the supply gaps, right? So because now we're looking at trying to create equity, saying that no matter where you go in the city, you should be able to find a level of emergency food. So now we're looking at, okay, where have we not been going where there's need versus what, the hunger gap is saying. So we call it the supply gap. So where are the least supplies of emergency food?
Does everybody understand that? Have neighborhoods that are known to be, they get a lot of food. So it's not so important to bring our food, City Harvest food there, but to find the places that have radar, basically. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, there's a whole formula that we use to get there. We're actually, right now, what I want to do is there's also something called self-sufficiency, which says how much money do you need to be clothed, housed, and fed in New York City? Because so much of how we calculate need is based on poverty. And like I said, in New York City, on average, you need $70,000 for a family of 3 to be self-sufficient. And that's the average, right? Like there's some places in the Bronx and some places on Staten Island where, you might be able to get away with 50,000. And then there's places where like the Upper East Side where you need like 120,000. So 70,000 is the average, depending on where you live but it depends on where you live. But like, but all the different, um, all everyone uses poverty. So even that Feeding America Map the Meal Gap, they're using poverty. And so there's a significant undercount. So I'm hoping that in the next few years we can start to build self-sufficiency into how we think about neighborhoods in need as well. Let's see.
There's a report on the City Harvest website about this self-sufficiency. You can look
Yeah,
at your
and you can see it by neighborhood and different things what the this self-sufficiency is for those efforts, like different areas. What are some of the largest obstacles you've had to overcome working for City Harvest, and how have they changed how you look at things? I think the largest obstacle I've faced is the fact that a lot of people don't understand the people we serve, even at City Harvest, right? I think that there's always been a thought that we serve the poor. There's a thought that we serve the homeless. There's a thought that the people in need, they're lazy, they're whatever, I think that, combating that thought has been it, or I remember we used to have someone who worked with us who said, because I used to complain that the trucks were late to different agencies. Shouldn't they be happy to just accept their free food? Thank goodness he doesn't work here anymore. But that mindset, and it's not just within City Harvest, it's within the world, right? People are just lazy. And so that is one of the largest obstacles to face. And I think when we started participating in the self-sufficiency study, I think that opened a lot of eyes to the fact that, we were serving people, we were serving people like them, right? So we were serving people who made the same amount of money that you might be making or what have you, but for whatever reasons, they were struggling. Maybe they didn't have a family to help them, maybe whatever the case may be. So I think that we're turning the corner, but it's been hard work. And you have to tell me when to stop. I'm not sure when your class ends. There's a lot of questions. When distributing food to those in need, like in Texas, how do you determine who gets what food, how much food? Does City Harvest take into consideration food preferences or individual dietary needs, religious, vegan, gluten, allergy sensitivities? So in Texas, I just did what I was told. I didn't know the area. I didn't make any decisions on where the food went in Texas or how they operated. I was just there to be an extra set of hands. And so I did whatever Arlene told me to. So she told me to drive 2 hours away and do an assessment of what the needs were at a pantry. That's what I did. And they have a really good system. Like their system, people can order the food that the food banks can, the emergency food programs can order what they want from the food bank. Really, I was there to do assessments to see how they were going to build the different pantries back up, because I had done capacity work for New York City and I had responded to Sandy. So that was more so my role. And like I said, we take into consideration kosher. Previously, we're trying to do that with halal, but we have to rebuild the way that we inventory our system. Most of the food that we give, like around sensitivities, they're labeled so people would see. So if you go to a pantry and you have a gluten allergy, you would not pick up something that had gluten in it. It's going to be labeled. Since 60% of what we do is fresh produce, that alleviates some of that. And it also helps for vegans. But what I think we need to do, and this is also a part of my issue with the allocation system, you have an allocation system that might send, the plantains to the kosher neighborhood when you should be sending them to Washington Heights or, Flatbush. So, how do we take into account who lives in different communities? Or you're sending the bok choy certain places and not to the more Asian communities. And so just really thinking about how do we really serve this very diverse city so that people can eat foods that are more aligned with their cultures. I think that that's important. Of course, we'll still send things to places that we'll still send things to other places with, nutrition education and so on and so forth. We're not saying that if you live in, Flatbush, you can't get bok choy, but we also want to make sure that where there are higher numbers of people who have recipes that call for that, we try to get better. We're doing a lot of that manually right now, which makes it harder, but I'm hoping again for that new allocation system.
Let me just add something too. It sort of depends on the pantries and how the pantries are set up. If they have customer choice, people go through the shelves as if it's a grocery store and pick what they want. But especially with the pandemic, a lot of the pantries had to give that up and just pack bags. So people all got the same thing. And what the pantry people were finding was that people were throwing things into the garbage as they left the pantry. So the client choice is a much better option, but pantries had to put it aside because they couldn't have people come to stores.
Yeah.
It's coming back.
But that's one of the reasons why we want to start to think about, from our perspective, sending the food to places where we know that there's certain populations to account for those places where they're just going to pack the bag and people don't have that choice. What was it like being sent to Texas to help trouble spots, especially during the time when we ourselves were somewhat troubled? Well, we weren't really impacted by Harvey and all of those hurricanes that much. So it wasn't in that moment, it wasn't that hard, right? I mean, there were a few neighborhoods that had a little, nothing like with Sandy. So in a lot of ways, City Harvest was still operating, as, just normally during that time. So that was, when I was in Texas, mostly it was after I was out in the field working at the programs, coming in and making sure I was doing a lot of the administrative stuff, like making sure I signed off on people's timesheets and things like that, so people got paid. But there wasn't really any, it didn't really impact us that much at the organization. And then these are both, there's like 3 different questions that are all kind of similar. So what are some things you experienced while in Texas? How was Texas? And what was it like in Texas after the hurricane? Did the U.S. provide enough resources to the residents of the area? And what areas of Texas were you sent to help? What upset you? There's a lot of Texas. What upset you the most while helping out in Texas? So I think what I experienced the most and what upset me the most was seeing the widespread destruction. Like, it was, like I said, I used to have a video. I used to have a video of my phone of me just driving for blocks and blocks and blocks, and all you saw was like wood and things like that outside of people's homes, and just thinking about what that rebuilding process was going to look like. And I was in Beaumont, Texas, which is, like I said, about 2.5 hours away from, well, the Houston airport. That's how long I drove. And it was a small food bank. I think their budget was like 5 million. They, like I said, they had one person working in their department that served agencies. It was and so they didn't have the resources to get what like the Houston food bank got, right? I think that was one of the biggest challenges. People tend to, it's almost like what happens with our emergency food programs, even in New York City. The large guys get all the support because they know how to get it, and the smaller folks got to kind of scramble for whatever they possibly can. And I think that was the same thing I saw for that food bank, right? They were not getting the same level of support that a lot of the major food banks in the country were getting. I was really happy that City Harvest could support them. Like, not only did I go down, but we sent 2 drivers, so with trucks. So they had trucks. So those trucks were loaded up every day, and the drivers were going around just delivering food. But they needed so much more than that, right? They needed a larger investment. And so I think the U.S. did a great job in supporting maybe individuals, FEMA and all that, but I don't think that they did a good enough job supporting the people who support the people. Um, that's just, kind of my take on it. Um, and it was, and even though I was in Beaumont, Texas, their service area was wide. Like I would sometimes go visit programs that were an hour and a half, 2 hours drive away from there. It was a very large service area. Um, so I was all over that little swath of Texas. In some neighborhoods I don't recall, and some neighborhoods where I definitely kept the doors locked because they had never seen Black people. Since you were involved in helping deal with Hurricane Sandy disaster, what type of skills did you take away from that tragedy? Now, this is where I'll say Sandy really helped me with the pandemic because, like I said, we emailed ourselves spreadsheets, and I spent the first 3 days of Sandy working from my couch because subways were down, there was still power out in a lot of places. But it helped me to be in the moment or be able to kind of pivot and get comfortable with not having the resources of the office or anything like that. So I think when so just being nimble. So I think when the pandemic happened and we all had to go home, it wasn't as bad because like we still had electricity, but that ability to pivot and work from home and things like that, I think I started to cultivate that with Sandy. You were equally affected by the disaster Hurricane Sandy. How long did it take you guys to get City Harvest running to the point that you could help others? Did other organizations jump in? Is there emergency funding put in place? Did the state help out or just insurance money? If so, was it just compensation to help? So we were back up and running in 24 hours. Even though we lost all our trucks, we had the funding to be able to go out and rent trucks. So we were able to do that. We did lose our cooler, but fortunately with coolers and freezers, as you know, it stays cold for a bit. So we were able to get that food out and not have it go bad. We then had to rent coolers and freezers, and we were able to get our cooler fixed once it was dried out because it flooded. We used to be right on the water. Yeah, we were up and running in 24 hours, which was great. What Sandy showed me, and we had this happen at the pandemic too, and people say New Yorkers are horrible people. When disasters happen, people actually really do come together. And we had a flood of donations coming in. We had people just randomly showing up with trucks of things, even from out of state. Like there was blankets that came from a hotel in DC that just randomly showed up at the warehouse. So there was help coming from everywhere. The government did pitch in. They, of course, did the government thing, and you had to fill out a bunch of forms, and it took a long time. It took longer to get some of that help, but we did get it. Um, uh, it we didn't have emergency funding at that point, but Sandy taught us that we always needed to have a reserve, and so we created a $5 million kind of emergency reserve. Now we're trying to bring that up to 20 million because the pandemic showed us that you're going to need a little bit more money than $5 million. So that's something we did have in place. I don't know. I'm sure we got insurance money, but that's a finance question. But yeah, it was. We were. Like I said, I was navigating trucks from my couch within a day.
I just want to mention a lot of nonprofits don't have any reserves.
Yeah.
City Harvest is actually different from a lot of organizations, and then it does.
Yeah.
Plan for it.
So that's fun. What skills experience did you learn from being involved in projects like dealing with the hurricane and being sent to Texas that you apply on a regular basis? Interestingly enough, it's not a skill, but it's a mindset. Because I think that when disasters and things happen, a pandemic, whatever, everyone is very keen to help. But what people don't recognize is that the folks who are food insecure are facing disasters every day. You know, a hospital bill came in and now I can't pay my rent. You know, it's not global disasters, it's not storms, but people who face food insecurity literally face disasters every day. And so I don't want to only think about things when it's tragic or when it's, widespread. It's really boiling that down to the individual people that we work with. And so I think that because I was hearing stories from people who were newly affected, like with Sandy and things like, yeah, I can't pay for this because I have to do this. And I was sitting there and I'm like, I hear this from people who go to food pantries all the time, right? It's just instead of I have to choose between, rebuilding or the mortgage or this or that, it's I have to choose between Pampers and food, right? So that really is kind of the what I apply on a regular basis. Um, have you done anything during the pandemic to help those in need and during the lockdown? Um, yeah, we shifted a lot of the way that we work. So, previously City Harvest would just show up and here's a case of bananas, do what you will. We started to repack food so that people, because they didn't have volunteers or the volunteers couldn't be in the space, so the food would show up as it needed to go out. So literally you could have one person there who could leave food on a table for people and they could come and get it to 6 feet apart. That kind of thing. We we brought on a bunch of new programs so that because there were programs that had to shut down for they didn't have anyone to come, and people would shut down because of COVID outbreaks and things like that. We gave out a ton of PPE. We're still giving out PPE. We're actually giving out COVID tests now as well at